Just a quick charge. My dad texted me at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of message that had become so routine over the years I barely registered it as a request anymore, more like a formality he went through before doing whatever he'd already decided to do. Need to move some money for the roof repair. We'll pay you back by Friday like always. I want to be honest about how normalized this had become because I think that's the only way any of what happened next makes sense. My father, Walter, had been borrowing small amounts from me in this exact way for almost 6 years, going back to before I'd even started my own business, when I was still working an account manager job and he was between contracts, doing freelance construction work that paid unevenly and sometimes not at all for months at a stretch. It started small, $200 here, $400 there, always with the same phrasing, always framed as temporary, always paid back, more or less, eventually, sometimes with an actual apology for the delay, and sometimes with a vague explanation about a client who was slow to settle up. He'd never asked me directly, not really, not in the sense of waiting for a yes before acting. That wasn't how it worked between us. He'd text me a heads up, sometimes minutes before doing the thing, sometimes, as I would learn that day, hours after he'd already started. It was a pattern built entirely around the assumption that I would say yes, because I always had, because he was my father, because some deep, stubborn part of me still operated according to a childhood logic where taking care of him wasn't a choice so much as a fact of the relationship, unquestioned the way gravity is unquestioned. I run a small marketing consultancy, for years old that spring, finally profitable enough the previous quarter that I'd stopped lying awake every night doing anxious mental math about payroll. It had taken everything I had to get there, 2 years of underpaying myself, so I could actually pay my 2 employees, Danny and Priyanka, a full salary, a brutal stretch during year 2 when I nearly folded the whole thing after losing our 2 biggest retainer clients within the same month. Countless nights spent building pitch decks at my kitchen table because I couldn't yet justify office space beyond the small rented suite we eventually moved into once things stabilized. The business account existed because my accountant, a meticulous woman named Ferris who'd basically saved my financial life during that second-year crisis, had set it up that way from day one, entirely separate from my personal accounts, clean books, the kind of structure that made tax season bearable and made me look legitimate to the 2 employees who depended on me for their livelihoods and legitimate, too, to the handful of clients who occasionally asked to see evidence of financial stability before signing a longer contract. My father had access to it, not because he needed it for anything to do with the business, obviously, but because 3 years earlier, during a health scare that turned out to be far less serious than the initial test suggested, I'd added him as an authorized user during a stretch of about 6 weeks when I genuinely believed I might be facing something life-altering and wanted someone who could step in and handle the business's basic finances, if I couldn't. It had been an act of pure practical caution in a frightening moment, nothing more. And once the health scare resolved into a manageable, ordinary diagnosis instead of the catastrophic one we'd all briefly feared, I simply never got around to removing him. Ferris had actually flagged it once, gently, during a routine account review about a year later. "You've still got your dad listed as an authorized user here. Did you want to keep that?" And I remember shrugging it off, saying something like, he'd never touch it without asking, he's not like that, and Ferris, who'd met my father exactly twice at holiday parties I'd invited her to out of politeness, had simply nodded and moved on to the next line item, because it wasn't her place to argue with my read on my own family. I was in a client meeting when the first text came through, pitching a rebrand package to a regional healthcare network that would have been, if we landed it, the biggest single contract in the company's 4-year history. My phone was face down on the conference table the way I always kept it during pitches, a small professional discipline I'd built specifically because Danny had once caught me glancing at a notification mid-sentence during an earlier pitch and gently suggested, afterward, that clients notice things like that more than we think they do. So I didn't see my father's message until almost 2 hours later. Once the meeting wrapped, and I was walking back to my car through the parking garage, scrolling through a backlog of notifications the way you do after any long meeting, half paying attention. By then, he'd already sent 3 more texts, stacked one after another with escalating urgency I only registered in hindsight, reading them in the wrong order entirely, chronology scrambled by how notifications had bunched together on my lock screen. "Can you call me when you get a sec? Read one. Sent at 10:15. It's a little more than I said. Read another. sent at 10:47, with no further context attached to what it actually referred to. "Don't worry, it's temporary," read the third, sent at 11:20, in the specific reassuring tone I'd learned, over 6 years of these small transactions, to associate with problems considerably larger than whatever number he'd originally quoted. I called him standing in the parking garage, phone against my ear, one hand still holding my laptop bag, adrenaline from the pitch meeting not yet fully drained out of my system, replaced almost immediately by a different, colder kind of alertness as I listened to him not quite answer any of my actual questions. "Dad, what's going on? Your texts are all over the place. How much are we actually talking about here?" "It's handled," he said, in the falsely breezy tone I'd learned, over 4 decades of being his daughter, to recognize as the sound of a much bigger problem than he was willing to name directly, the tone he'd used when I was 11, and he told me the car trouble was nothing serious 3 days before it stranded us on the highway, the tone he'd used when my mother asked him, the year before their divorce, whether everything was okay with the mortgage. "I'll explain everything tonight. It's under control, sweetheart. I promise. I just needed to move faster on the roof thing than I expected. The contractor gave me a same-day discount if I paid up front, and I didn't want to miss the window." Something in me wanted to press harder right there in the parking garage, wanted to demand the actual number before hanging up, but I had a second client call scheduled in 11 minutes, an actual paying client waiting on the other end of a video call I couldn't reschedule without real professional cost, and some old, deeply worn groove in me, the one that had always prioritized keeping the peace with my father over pressing him for uncomfortable specifics, won out over my better judgment. "Okay," I said. "We'll talk tonight. But Dad, please, whatever this is, don't do anything else without actually telling me the number first." "Of course," he said, already sounding like he was moving on to something else, already halfway out of the conversation before I'd even hung up, and I got into my car and drove to my next meeting telling myself it was fine. It was probably a few $100s over whatever he'd originally quoted, manageable, the way it always had been before. I didn't check the account balance until 7 p.m., after my second client meeting of the day and a brutal hour of revisions to the healthcare network proposal that Danny had flagged needed reworking before we could send it. Looking back, I think some part of me avoided checking earlier on purpose, the way you avoid stepping on a scale after a meal you already regret, not wanting to confirm something I suspected, in some quiet, unacknowledged corner of my mind, might be worse than I was letting myself believe. I sat in my car in the parking garage beneath my office, the same garage where I'd taken his call that morning, phone lighting up my face in the dim concrete stairwell light, and pulled up the business banking app. The number on the screen took a full 10 seconds to actually register as real, because my brain kept trying to reinterpret it as a typo, a system error, anything other than what it plainly was. $15,800. Gone. In 10 hours, while I sat through pitch decks and client calls, believing my father's texts had described something manageable, something temporary, something that could wait until evening to be handled properly. I scrolled through the transaction history with hands that had gone strangely steady, the specific calm that sometimes arrives right after genuine shock, before the actual feeling catches up. 3 transfers, spaced roughly 2 hours apart across the morning and early afternoon, $4,200, then $6,600, then a final transfer of $5,000 that had gone through at 1:40 p.m., barely 20 minutes after he'd told me on the phone that everything was handled and under control.
He'd known the real number by then.
He'd known it was $15,000, not a little more than whatever he'd originally texted, and he'd told me it was handled anyway, in the specific tone reserved for problems he had no intention of letting me see clearly until he'd already finished creating them. I called Ferris first, before I called my father, because some instinct told me I needed an accountant's clear-eyed assessment of the actual damage before I let myself have the family conversation that was clearly coming. She picked up on the second ring, and I explained it as steadily as I could manage, watching my own hand shake slightly on the steering wheel despite how calm my voice sounded. "Okay," she said, in the brisk, practical tone that had gotten me through worse crises than this one over the years. "First question, do you have payroll going out this week?" "Friday," I said. "For Danny and Priyanka. And do you have $15,000 sitting anywhere else to cover this gap in the meantime?" I did the math in my head. Fast, the specific anxious arithmetic I'd trained myself out of doing every night during year 2 of the business, the arithmetic I'd been so relieved to finally stop doing regularly. I had roughly $6,000 in a business savings buffer Ferris had insisted I build up the previous year, plus whatever was still sitting in accounts receivable from 2 clients who hadn't yet paid their most recent invoices, neither of which I could count on landing before Friday. It wasn't enough. Not close to enough. Not with the healthcare network contract still unsigned and every other retainer already accounted for against existing expenses. Not quite, I said. Okay, Farah said again, and I could hear her already moving into problem-solving mode, the specific competence that had saved the business once before. We'll figure out payroll first thing tomorrow. There's a short-term option we can look at, a business line of credit I flagged for you months ago that we never activated. It should still be available given your current financials. That buys you breathing room. But, Renata, I have to ask you directly, because I think you already know what I'm going to say. Your father needs to be removed from that account tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I know, I said, and something in my chest cracked slightly, hearing it said out loud by someone outside the family, someone who had no emotional investment in protecting him from the consequences of what he'd done. I called my father after I hung up with Ferris, sitting alone in my car in that same parking garage, watching the fluorescent lights flicker slightly against the concrete ceiling, feeling something in me go very still and very cold in a way I didn't fully recognize from any previous conversation we'd had. Hey, sweetheart, he said, picking up almost immediately, his voice carrying the same falsely breezy tone from that morning, though something underneath it now sounded slightly more brittle, like a man who suspected the conversation ahead of him wasn't going to go the way he'd hoped. I was just about to call you. I wanted to explain before you saw the $15,800, I said, cutting him off, my voice coming out flatter and steadier than I felt. That's what's gone from my business account. Not a little more than the roof repair. $15,800 in 3 separate transfers, the last one going out after you told me on the phone that everything was handled. There was a long pause on his end, long enough that I heard him exhale slowly, the sound of a man deciding, in real time, how much of the actual truth he was prepared to give me. It's not what it looks like, he said finally. Then tell me what it actually looks like. Another pause. The roof repair was real, he said. That part was true. I swear to you, the contractor really did need $4,000 up front for materials before he'd start the job. But then he stopped, and I heard him swallow audibly. There was a situation with a debt I owed. An old one. From a few years back, a business deal that didn't work out the way I thought it would, and the guy I owed money to, he called me this week, said he needed it settled by end of day, or he was going to go to collector, and I panicked, and I knew you had money sitting in that account, and I told myself I'd pay you back before you even noticed, the same way I always have. You've never taken $15,000 before, I said. You've taken 200, 400, maybe 800, once during a bad month. This isn't the same pattern, Dad. This is a completely different scale, and you knew that, and you decided to let me find out on my own after the fact, instead of actually telling me the real number, when you still had time to ask me directly whether I could even afford this. I know, he said, and for the first time in the conversation, something in his voice actually cracked, something that sounded less like performance and more like genuine fear. I know how it looks. I panicked, Renata. I've never been good under that kind of pressure, you know that about me, and I made a bad decision in the moment, and I should have called you the second I realized how much I actually needed instead of doing it first and explaining after. Payroll is Friday, I said. For 2 employees who have nothing to do with any of this, who depend on me, the same way I apparently still let myself depend on you being honest with me. I don't have the buffer to cover what you took and still make payroll on time. Do you understand what you might have actually broken here? This isn't just my money. It was never just my money. He didn't have an answer for that. The silence on his end stretched out long enough that I finally said, quietly, I'm removing you from the account tonight. I should have done it years ago. I'm sorry it's happening like this, but it's happening. I called Ferris's bank contact directly that night, using the emergency line she'd given me years earlier for exactly this kind of after-hours problem, though neither of us had ever imagined the emergency would be my own father. The representative walked me through freezing the account's authorized user access immediately, a process that took less time than I expected, disturbingly little time given how much damage had been done in the 10 hours before I'd caught it. By 9 that evening, Walter no longer had access to a single account connected to my business, a fact that felt less like triumph and more like closing a door that should have been locked years earlier, the specific grief of recognizing your own negligence alongside someone else's. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table with Ferris's emergency line of credit paperwork spread out in front of me, filling out an application at 11 p.m. for a business credit facility I'd never wanted to need, running the numbers over and over to make sure payroll would clear Friday regardless of what else happened. I thought more than once about calling Danny and Priyanka to explain, and then talked myself out of it each time because there was no version of that conversation that didn't involve telling two people who trusted me with their livelihoods that my own father had put their paychecks at risk, and I wasn't ready yet to say that out loud to anyone who wasn't already family. The line of credit came through the next morning, faster than Ferris had expected, enough to cover the gap with room to spare, and I called her back once the confirmation email landed to thank her, my voice still tight with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. "You did the right thing," she said, meaning the account freeze, and I appreciated that she said it plainly, without softening it into something more diplomatic. "I know it doesn't feel good. It's not supposed to feel good. But you protected the business, and you protected Danny and Priyanka, and that had to come before protecting your dad's feelings about it." Payroll cleared Friday morning, on time, exactly as it always had, and neither Danny nor Priyanka ever learned how close that particular Friday had come to being different, a fact I was grateful for in a complicated way, since keeping it from them meant carrying the full weight of it myself, rather than distributing any part of that anxiety onto people who'd done nothing to deserve it. My father called 4 more times that first week, and I let most of them go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't trust myself yet to have the conversation calmly, and I'd learned, over 4 decades, that conversations with him conducted in anger tended to end with me apologizing for my own anger rather than addressing whatever he'd actually done. When I finally did call him back, 6 days after the transfers, I'd had time to think clearly about what I actually needed from him, rather than reacting purely out of the raw shock of that first parking garage phone call. "I need to understand the full picture," I told him, sitting on my back porch that evening, a notepad in front of me the way I might approach any difficult client negotiation, because some part of me had decided, consciously, to treat this conversation with the same structured clarity I brought to my actual work, rather than letting it dissolve into the familiar emotional fog these conversations usually generated. "Not just the roof and the old debt. I need to know exactly what you owed, to whom, whether it's actually settled now, and whether there's any chance something like this happens again." He walked me through it, haltingly at first, and then with more detail as I kept asking specific, unemotional questions rather than letting him retreat into vague reassurance. The debt was real, a failed investment in a friend's contracting business 4 years earlier that Walter had co-signed for, a debt he'd been quietly managing with small payments for years without ever telling me or my sister the actual scope of it, until the friend's creditor had finally lost patience and threatened more serious collection action. The roof repair had been real too, layered on top of the same week purely by unfortunate timing, which was part of why he'd conflated the two in his initial texts, not fully separating for himself, in the panic of the moment, which piece of the crisis he was actually solving with which portion of my money. "Is it settled now?" I asked. "The debt, I mean, completely. Or is there more coming?" "It's settled," he said. I paid the full amount owed. There's nothing else outstanding from that specific situation. And the roof. Also handled. Also fully paid."
He paused.
"I know that doesn't make what I did okay. I'm not trying to make it sound like it worked out fine just because both things got fixed. I took money that wasn't mine to take, without actually asking you first, and I lied to you on the phone about it being handled when I already knew it was $15,000 I was taking, not a few hundred. I've been sitting with that this whole week, and I don't have a good excuse for it. I panicked, and panic made me a coward instead of someone who could just call you and say the real number and let you say no if you needed to say no. It wasn't a complete accounting of everything I wanted from him. It didn't address, for instance, the 6 years of smaller borrowing that had built the pattern in the first place, the assumption baked into every one of those routine text messages that I would simply say yes because I always had, but it was more honesty than he'd given me in that first frantic phone call. And I decided, sitting on my porch with my notepad now mostly full of his answers, that I could work with this much honesty, even if the deeper patterns still needed addressing separately. "I'm not adding you back to any account," I told him. "Not the business account, not ever again, regardless of what happens in the future. If you need help, you call me and ask directly, and I decide in advance whether I can actually give it, the way any adult should be asked rather than simply helping himself and explaining afterward." "That's fair," he said, and I heard something in his voice that sounded like genuine acceptance rather than the wounded defensiveness I'd half expected. "More than fair. And I need you to pay me back. All of it. Not eventually, not whenever things settle down for you. I need an actual schedule, in writing, the way I'd require of any client who owed my business money. I can't run a company on the assumption that money might come back someday, if I'm lucky." He agreed to that too, and over the following months he mostly held to it, sending payments in increments that were sometimes late but never entirely absent, a pattern that felt different from the old one precisely because it existed inside boundaries I'd actually stated out loud and had left to his own private judgment. The business survived the immediate crisis more easily than I expected, in the end, though the margin had been thinner than I liked admitting even to myself. The healthcare network contract came through 3 weeks later, a genuinely large win that eased the financial pressure considerably and let me pay down the emergency line of credit faster than the terms required. Danny and Priyanka never learned the details of that particular week, though Danny did comment once, months later, that I'd seemed unusually stressed that spring, and I told him only that there'd been some family stuff, which was true enough without requiring me to hand him a burden that wasn't his to carry. What stayed with me longest wasn't the number itself, though $15,800 is not a small thing to lose in 10 hours, not for a business 4 years into finally feeling stable. What stayed with me was the specific shape of the lie in the middle of it, not the initial ask, which had been real and which I might have genuinely agreed to if he'd simply told me the true number up front, but the moment on the phone at 11:40 that morning when he'd already known the total was $15,000 and told me instead that everything was handled, that it was under control, buying himself hours of continued access while I sat in client meetings believing a much smaller, much safer story than the one actually unfolding in my account. I think about that gap often, the space between what he said and what he knew to be true, because it clarified something about our whole relationship that I'd spent years not looking at directly. It wasn't that my father was a bad man, exactly, or even, in the end, a fundamentally dishonest one in the broader sense of his life. It was that somewhere along the way, in 100 small accumulated moments of me saying yes, without asking hard questions, he'd learned that my trust could be managed rather than earned, that a reassuring tone would buy him time regardless of whether the reassurance was true. Removing him from that account wasn't really about the $15,000 in the end, even though the money mattered enormously in the moment. It was about finally refusing to let that particular pattern continue operating on its old, unquestioned terms and insisting for the first time in 6 years that being asked honestly mattered more to me than being asked at all.